The sound of Mark's hand hitting my face echoed through our small living room like a gunshot. For a moment, everything went silent. My cheek burned with a fire that spread down to my neck, and I could taste blood where my teeth had cut into my lip. But it wasn't the pain that made my heart stop. It was seeing Jake standing in the doorway, his school backpack still hanging from his small shoulders. His brown eyes, so much like mine, were wide with shock. My 10-year-old son had just watched his father slap his mother. "Maya, you stupid girl." Linda's voice cut through the silence like a knife. Mark's mother sat in her favorite chair, the one she'd claimed as hers since moving in 3 months ago. Her lips curved into a satisfied smile that made my stomach turn. "Maybe now you'll learn to keep your mouth shut when adults are talking." I touched my burning cheek, feeling the heat under my fingertips. This wasn't the first time Mark had hit me, but it was the first time Jake had seen it. All those months of hiding bruises under makeup, of making excuses for why I walked carefully or why I flinched when doors slammed too loud. All of that careful protection had just crumbled in one terrible moment. "Jake, honey, go to your room," I whispered, my voice shaking. I didn't want him to see any more of this. I didn't want him to see his mother weak and broken. But Jake didn't move. He stood there, staring at his father with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't fear or sadness like I expected. It was something colder, something that made him look older than his 10 years. "Did you just hit my mom?" Jake's voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made everyone in the room turn to look at him. Mark straightened up, running his hand through his dark hair. "Jake, you don't understand. Your mother was being disrespectful to Grandma Linda. Sometimes grown-ups have to—" "You hit my mom," Jake said again, cutting his father off. His small hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Linda laughed, a harsh sound that made me want to cover my ears. "Oh, the little boy wants to play hero. How sweet. Maya, you've raised quite the dramatic child." I wanted to defend Jake, to tell Linda to leave my son alone, but my throat felt closed up. The taste of blood in my mouth reminded me of what happened when I spoke up, when I tried to protect myself or my son from their cruelty. "Jake, please just go to your room." I tried again, reaching toward him. "Everything's okay." But everything wasn't okay, and we all knew it. Jake looked at me with those wise eyes that had seen too much for a child his age. He'd been watching, I realized. He'd been seeing more than I thought I was hiding. "No, Mom," Jake said, his voice getting stronger. "Everything's not okay." Mark took a step toward Jake, and I saw my son's jaw tighten. "Boy, you better watch your tone with me. I'm your father." "Fathers don't hit mothers," Jake said simply. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Linda's smirk faltered for just a second before returning full force. Mark's face turned red, the same color it got when he'd been drinking. "You little—" Mark started, raising his hand again. But something in Jake's face stopped him. My son wasn't backing down. He wasn't crying or running away like most kids would. Instead, he was studying his father with a look that was almost calculating. "I'm going to my room now," Jake said quietly. "But I'm not forgetting this." He turned and walked away, his footsteps slow and deliberate on the wooden floor. I heard his bedroom door close with a soft click. Linda clapped her hands together, delighted. "Well, that was entertaining. Maya, you really need to teach that boy some respect." But I wasn't listening to Linda anymore. I was thinking about the look in Jake's eyes. It wasn't the look of a scared little boy. It was the look of someone making a plan. And somehow that scared me more than Mark's anger ever had. I remember the first time I met Mark like it was yesterday. I was 24, working at the same bakery where I still work now, and he came in every morning for coffee and a blueberry muffin. He had this smile that made my heart skip, and he always asked about my day like he really cared about the answer. "You're too pretty to be working so hard," he'd say, leaning against the counter while I packed his order. "Someone should be taking care of you." Back then, those words felt like a promise. Now I know they were a warning. Mark was different in those early days. He brought me flowers for no reason and held doors open for me. When we went out to dinner, he'd pull out my chair and tell me I was the most beautiful woman in the restaurant. I felt like a princess in a fairy tale, but fairy tales don't prepare you for meeting the dragon's mother. Linda made her feelings clear from our very first meeting. Mark had invited me to Sunday dinner at her house, and I spent hours picking out the perfect dress. I wanted so badly for his mother to like me. "So you work at a bakery," Linda said, looking me up and down like I was something stuck to her shoe. How quaint. She served dinner on her best china, but somehow I got the chipped plate. When I offered to help with dishes, she waved me away. "Oh no, dear. I'm sure you're tired from all that baking." The way she said baking made it sound like something dirty. Mark didn't notice, or maybe he chose not to. After dinner, he walked me to my car with his arm around my waist. "Mom's just protective," he said when I mentioned how cold she'd been. "She'll warm up to you?" 8 years later, I'm still waiting for that warmth. The changes in Mark started small, so small I almost missed them. First, he began commenting on my clothes. "That dress is a little tight, don't you think? You don't want people getting the wrong idea." Then it was my friends. "Why do you need to go out with the girls so much? Don't you want to spend time with me?" One by one, my friendships faded away. It was easier than fighting about them. Easier than explaining why I couldn't go to birthday parties or girls' nights anymore. After we got married, Linda's visits became more frequent. She'd show up unannounced and rearrange my kitchen cabinets. "This is how Mark likes things organized," she'd say, moving my dishes to shelves I couldn't reach without a step stool. When Jake was born, I thought things might get better. I thought becoming a grandmother would soften Linda's heart. Instead, it gave her new ammunition. "The baby's crying again," she'd tell Mark when she visited. "Maya must not be feeding him enough." "Jake's clothes are wrinkled. Doesn't Maya know how to iron?" "That child needs more discipline. Maya's too soft with him." Mark started repeating her criticisms. "Mom's right, Maya. You need to try harder." Try harder. Those 2 words became the soundtrack of my life. Try harder to keep the house clean. Try harder to make better dinners. Try harder to be the wife and mother they expected me to be. The first time Mark yelled at me, Jake was 3 years old. I'd burned dinner because Jake had fallen and scraped his knee, and I was busy cleaning his wound and kissing it better. "This is garbage," Mark shouted, throwing his plate in the sink so hard it cracked. "My mother never served my father burned food." I apologized and made him a sandwich, my hands shaking as I spread the peanut butter. Jake watched from his high chair, his little face serious and worried. That night, I called my sister in California. "I think I made a mistake," I whispered into the phone after Mark fell asleep. "Marriage is hard work," she said. "You just need to communicate better." So I tried harder. I always tried harder. The yelling became normal. The criticism became daily. And slowly, so slowly I didn't notice it happening, I began to believe that maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe I did need to try harder. Maybe I deserved what was coming. Everything changed the day Mark lost his job. I was frosting cupcakes at the bakery when my phone buzzed with his text. "Got fired, don't ask questions." I knew better than to ask questions anyway. Mark didn't like explaining himself, especially when things went wrong, but I could feel the storm coming even before I got home that evening. He was sitting at the kitchen table with an empty beer bottle in front of him, staring at nothing. The silence in the house felt heavy, like the air before a tornado. "How was work?" I asked carefully, setting down my purse. "There is no work," he said without looking at me. "Thanks to some lies from jealous coworkers." I wanted to ask what happened, but the way his jaw was clenched told me to stay quiet. Instead, I started making dinner, moving around the kitchen as softly as possible. That's when Linda announced she was moving in. "It's just temporary," she said, standing in our doorway with 2 suitcases and a satisfied smile. "Until Mark gets back on his feet. A man needs his family during hard times." She moved into our spare room, the one I'd been hoping to turn into a craft space someday. Within a week, she'd taken over the entire house. "Maya, you're using too much detergent," she'd say, redoing the laundry I'd just finished. "No wonder our electric bill is so high." "Maya, Jake's lunch isn't nutritious enough. When I raised Mark, I made sure he had proper meals." "Maya, this house is a mess. How can Mark focus on finding work when he comes home to chaos?" Mark started drinking more. 1 beer became 3, then 5. He'd sit in his chair after dinner, getting angrier with each bottle. And Linda would sit across from him, feeding his anger like kindling to a fire. "You know, son, when your father lost his job back in '89, I made sure he didn't have to worry about anything at home," she'd say, glancing at me. "A man needs peace in his own house." "You're right, Mom," Mark would agree, his words getting sloppier. "A man shouldn't have to come home to problems." I became the problem. If Jake left toys in the living room, it was my fault for not teaching him to clean up. If dinner was 5 minutes late, it was my fault for poor time management. If the bills were tight, it was my fault for not being more careful with money. The worst part was discovering that Mark had been sharing our private moments with Linda. Things I'd told him in confidence, fights we'd had behind closed doors, even details about our marriage that should have stayed between us. I found out by accident when I overheard Linda on the phone with her sister. "Oh yes, Maya's been giving Mark a hard time about money," Linda was saying. "And apparently she's not very affectionate anymore, if you know what I mean. Poor Mark is under so much stress." My face burned with shame and anger. Those were things I'd shared with Mark during our most vulnerable moments, when I was trying to explain why I felt distant, why I was struggling. He'd listened and nodded and promised to understand. Then he'd run straight to his mother with every word. I tried to talk to my old friend Jessica about it when she called one evening. But Mark was listening from the kitchen, and later that night he cornered me. "What did you tell Jessica about us?" he demanded, his breath heavy with beer. "Nothing. Don't lie to me, Maya. I heard you complaining about money, making me look bad to your friends." "I wasn't making you look bad, You were just what? Running your mouth about our private business?" Linda appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. "What's all this noise about?" "Maya's been talking to her friends about our problems," Mark said, like I was a child tattling on the playground. Linda shook her head sadly. "Maya, that's very disloyal. A wife should protect her husband's reputation, not damage it." I stopped calling Jessica after that. I stopped calling anyone. The isolation wrapped around me like a blanket, heavy and suffocating. Some days, the only adult conversation I had was with customers at the bakery. I started staying late, volunteering for extra shifts, just to delay going home. But I always had to go home eventually, and they were always waiting. I didn't know what Jake was doing in his room after Mark hit me. I assumed he was crying or trying to process what he'd seen. If I'd known the truth, I might have been terrified. Or maybe I would have been proud. My 10-year-old son wasn't crying. He was planning. The next morning, Jake seemed different at breakfast. Calmer somehow, like he'd made an important decision. He ate his cereal quietly while Mark read job listings on his phone, and Linda criticized the way I'd made the coffee. "This tastes weak, Maya," Linda said, pushing her cup away. "Don't you know how to make a proper cup of coffee?" "I'll make a fresh pot," I said automatically, already reaching for the coffee maker. "Don't bother," Mark muttered. "I'm going out to look for work anyway." After they left, Jake helped me clean the kitchen. He was unusually helpful, drying dishes without being asked and putting them away in exactly the right places. "Mom," he said quietly while we worked, "do you remember Mrs. Rodriguez from next door?" "Of course, honey. She's very nice." Mrs. Rodriguez had always been kind to us, bringing over extra vegetables from her garden and asking how we were doing. Sometimes I caught her watching our house with a concerned expression. "She used to help families, didn't she? Before she retired?" I paused in my wiping of the counter. "Yes, She was a social worker. Why do you ask? Jake shrugged, but there was something in his eyes that reminded me of the look he'd had the night before. Just curious. That afternoon, while I was at work, I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. Jake had seemed so serious, so focused. It wasn't like him to ask random questions about the neighbors. When I got home, Jake was already there, doing homework at the kitchen table. Linda was in her chair, watching her soap operas and making comments about how unrealistic the storylines were. At least those women know how to keep their men happy, she said pointedly when I walked in. I ignored her and went to start dinner. Jake looked up from his math homework and gave me a small smile. There was something different about that smile, too. It wasn't sad or worried like usual. It was almost hopeful. During dinner, Mark complained about his job search while Linda agreed with everything he said. I listened and nodded and tried to make myself invisible the way I'd learned to do. But I noticed Jake watching everything with those sharp eyes of his. He was paying attention to every cruel word, every dismissive gesture. I wondered what he was thinking. After dinner, while I cleaned up, Jake came into the kitchen. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart." He looked toward the living room where Mark and Linda were watching TV, then back at me. "Do you ever think about what it would be like if it was just you and me?" The question caught me off guard. "Jake, honey, why would you ask that?" "I just wonder sometimes. Like, what if we had our own little apartment somewhere? Just the two of us?" My heart ached at the hope in his voice. "Oh, baby, families don't work that way. Your dad loves you very much. But does he love you?" The question hung in the air between us. I opened my mouth to give him the answer I was supposed to give, the one about how relationships are complicated and adults sometimes disagree but still love each other. Instead, I found myself looking into my son's eyes and seeing a wisdom that shouldn't have been there. Jake had been watching. He'd been seeing things I thought I'd hidden from him. "It's complicated, honey," I finally said. Jake nodded like he'd expected that answer. "I know, Mom, but maybe it doesn't have to be." Before I could ask what he meant, Mark called from the living room. "Maya, bring me another beer." I hurried to get his beer, and when I came back to the kitchen, Jake was gone. I found him in his room later, door closed, talking quietly on his phone. When I knocked, he quickly said goodbye to whoever he was talking to. "Who was that, sweetheart?" "Just a friend from school," he said. "We were talking about a project." I believed him because I wanted to, because the alternative, that my 10-year-old was keeping secrets from me, was too scary to consider. That night, as I lay in bed listening to Mark snore beside me, I thought about Jake's questions. What would it be like if it was just the two of us? The thought filled me with a longing so sharp it took my breath away. But thoughts like that were dangerous. They led to hope, and hope led to disappointment. I had no idea that while I was lying there feeling hopeless, my son was 3 rooms away working on making that impossible dream come true. The next few days felt different, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Jake seemed more confident, walking taller and speaking up more at dinner. When Linda made her usual cutting remarks about my cooking or cleaning, I caught Jake watching her with an expression that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't fear or sadness, it was like he was studying her, memorizing every cruel word. "Jake, eat your vegetables," I said one evening, noticing he was staring at his grandmother instead of eating. "Yes, Mom," he said. But his eyes stayed on Linda for another moment before he looked down at his plate. Mark had been drinking more since losing his job. The beer bottles piled up faster each day, and his temper got shorter with each one. I found myself walking on eggshells constantly, trying to anticipate what might set him off. "Maya, this house is a disaster," Linda announced one afternoon when I got home from work. She was standing in the living room with her hands on her hips, surveying the space like a general inspecting troops. "How can Mark focus on finding employment when he comes home to this chaos?" I looked around the room. Jake's backpack was by the door, and there were a few magazines on the coffee table. It was hardly a disaster, but I'd learned not to argue. "I'll clean it up right away," I said, setting down my purse. "You should have cleaned it this morning before you left," Linda continued. "A proper wife maintains her home." I started picking up the magazines, my face burning with embarrassment. Jake appeared in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. "Grandma Linda," he said quietly. "Mom works really hard. She was up early making breakfast for everyone." Linda turned to look at him, her eyebrows raised. "Little boys shouldn't interrupt when adults are talking, Jake." "I'm not interrupting," Jake said, his voice steady. "I'm just saying Mom does a lot for this family." Something in his tone made Linda's expression shift. For just a moment she looked uncertain, then her usual smugness returned. "Well, aren't you the little defender?" she said with a laugh that didn't sound amused. "Maya, you're raising quite the mouthy child." That night, Mark came home angrier than usual. He'd been to 3 job interviews and hadn't heard back from any of them. He slammed the door so hard the pictures on the wall rattled. "This is all wrong," he muttered, looking around the kitchen where I was making dinner. "Everything's wrong." "What can I do to help?" I asked carefully. "You can stop asking stupid questions," he snapped. "And you can make sure this house is perfect when I get home. I don't need to deal with messes on top of everything else." Linda nodded approvingly from her chair. "Mark's under tremendous stress, Maya. The least you can do is make his home life peaceful." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, the feeling of being trapped with no way out. But then I noticed Jake standing in the hallway, and something about his expression calmed me. He looked confident, like he knew something I didn't. Over the next few days, I started noticing small things. Jake spent more time in his room with the door closed. He was on his phone more often, always ending calls quickly when I came near. And Mrs. Rodriguez seemed to be in her backyard more frequently, always waving when she saw me. "Mom," Jake said one evening while we were doing dishes together, "if someone was hurting you and you could make it stop, would you want to know how?" The question sent a chill down my spine. "Jake, honey, why would you ask something like that?" "Just wondering," he said, but his eyes were serious. "Sometimes people think they don't have choices, but maybe they do." Before I could respond, Mark called from the living room. "Maya, get in here!" I dried my hands quickly and hurried to see what he wanted. He was sitting in his chair with Linda beside him, both of them looking at me with expressions I didn't like. "We need to talk," Mark said, "about your attitude lately." "My attitude?" "You've been different," Linda added. "Distant. Disrespectful. Mark deserves better from his wife." I felt my heart start to race. "I don't understand. I've been trying to—" "You've been trying to what?" Mark's voice was getting louder. "Because, from where I'm sitting, it looks like you think you're too good for this family." I could see Jake in the hallway again, watching. But this time, instead of looking scared, he looked ready. Ready for what, I had no idea. The explosion came 3 days later on a Tuesday evening that started like any other nightmare. Mark had been drinking since noon, celebrating what he called a promising job interview that I suspected had gone badly. Linda sat in her chair like a queen on her throne, stirring the pot with every word that came out of her mouth. "You know, Mark, I've been thinking," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Maya's been very disrespectful lately. Very ungrateful for everything you provide." I was making dinner, trying to stay invisible, but I could feel the tension building like pressure in a kettle about to whistle. "You're right, Mom," Mark slurred, his words thick with beer. "I work my ass off for this family, and what do I get? Attitude." "I haven't given you any attitude," I said quietly, immediately regretting the words. Mark's head snapped up. "What did you just say?" My hands trembled as I stirred the pasta sauce. "Nothing, I just meant—" "No, you said something." Mark stood up, swaying slightly. "You contradicted me, in front of my mother." Linda's smile was sharp as a knife. See what I mean, son? No respect at all. Mark, please, I whispered. Jake will be home from his friend's house soon. Let's not— Don't tell me what to do in my own house. Mark's voice exploded through the kitchen. That's when I heard the front door open. Jake's voice called out, "I'm home!" And my heart sank. Not again. Please, not in front of Jake again. But Jake appeared in the kitchen doorway, and something was different about him. He wasn't surprised by the scene. He looked prepared. Maya thinks she can run this house, Mark continued, his voice getting louder. Thinks she can tell me what to do. That's not what I— Shut up, Mark roared, and his hand flew toward my face. But this time, I saw it coming. This time, I tried to duck. His palm caught me across the cheek anyway, harder than before. The force of it sent me stumbling backward into the counter. Pain exploded across my face and I tasted blood. Linda clapped her hands together like she was watching a show. Finally! Maybe now she'll learn some respect. That's when Jake stepped forward. Stop, he said, his voice clear and strong. Mark turned to look at his son, his face red with anger and alcohol. What did you say to me, boy? I said stop. Jake reached into his backpack and pulled out a small recording device. Because everything you just did is being recorded, and it's already been sent to the police. The room went completely silent. Mark stared at the device in Jake's hand like it was a snake about to strike. What the hell is that? Mark demanded. It's evidence, Jake said calmly, of you hitting Mom, of Grandma Linda encouraging you, of all the times you've hurt her when you thought no one was watching. Linda's smug expression melted off her face. You little— I have pictures too, Jake continued, his voice never wavering. Of Mom's bruises, videos of you yelling at her, recordings of Grandma Linda being mean to her every single day. Mark lunged toward Jake, but my son was ready. He stepped back and held up his phone. Mrs. Rodriguez has copies of everything, Jake said. And she's already called the police. They should be here any minute. As if summoned by his words, we heard the sound of sirens in the distance, getting closer. Mark's face went white. You called the police? On your own father? I called them on someone who hits my mom, Jake said simply. Linda jumped up from her chair. This is ridiculous. Mark, do something. But Mark was staring at Jake with a mixture of shock and something that might have been fear. How long have you been recording us? 3 months, Jake said. Ever since Grandma Linda moved in and things got worse. The sirens were getting louder now. Through the kitchen window, I could see red and blue lights flashing. I looked at my 10-year-old son standing there with his shoulders straight and his chin up, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. My little boy had saved us both. The police officers who came to our door were gentle but thorough. Officer Martinez, a woman with kind eyes, sat with me at the kitchen table while her partner talked to Mark and Linda in the living room. Jake stayed close to my side, his small hand holding mine. Mrs. Thompson, we need to document your injuries, Officer Martinez said softly. And we'll need to see the evidence your son collected. My face was swollen where Mark had hit me, and there was a cut on my lip that had started bleeding again. As the officer took pictures, I felt embarrassed and ashamed, but Jake squeezed my hand. You don't have to be embarrassed, Mom, he whispered. You didn't do anything wrong. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at our door with a folder full of printed photos and a USB drive. I have everything here, she told Officer Martinez. This brave boy has been documenting abuse for months. When the officers saw Jake's evidence, their expressions grew serious. There were photos of bruises on my arms and back that I thought I'd hidden well, videos of Mark screaming at me while I cowered in the corner, recordings of Linda's cruel words and Mark's threats. This is very thorough documentation, Officer Martinez told Jake. You did exactly the right thing. Mark was arrested that night. As they put handcuffs on him, he looked at Jake with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, but something like respect mixed with disbelief. "I can't believe my own son turned me in," he said quietly. "I can't believe my own father hit my mom," Jake replied, his voice steady. Linda packed her bags that same night. Before she left, she stood in our doorway one last time, her face twisted with anger. "You've ruined this family, Maya," she spat. "Mark was a good man before you poisoned him against me." "No, Grandma Linda," Jake said, stepping between us. "Dad was never good to Mom, and you made it worse." Linda looked down at her grandson with something like hatred. "You're no grandson of mine." "Good," Jake said simply. "I don't want to be." After they were gone, our house felt different. Bigger, somehow, like we could finally breathe. Mrs. Rodriguez stayed with us that first night, making tea and helping me ice my swollen face. "How did you know?" I asked Jake as we sat together on the couch. "How did you know to collect evidence?" "I've been watching for a long time, Mom," he said. "I saw how scared you were. I saw how you tried to protect me from seeing the bad stuff. But I saw it anyway." "Why didn't you tell me what you were planning?" Jake looked thoughtful. "Because you would have tried to stop me. You would have been worried about making Dad angrier. But I knew someone had to do something." The legal process took months. Mark was charged with domestic violence and assault. The evidence Jake had collected made the case strong, and Mark's lawyer advised him to take a plea deal. He was sentenced to anger management classes, community service, and a restraining order that kept him away from us. During those months, I started therapy. Dr. Williams helped me understand that what had happened wasn't my fault, that I deserved to be treated with respect and kindness. It was hard work, learning to believe I was worth protecting. Jake started seeing a counselor too, someone who specialized in helping children who had witnessed domestic violence. I worried that what he'd seen and done had damaged him somehow, but his counselor assured me that Jake was remarkably resilient. "He's a hero," she told me. "He saved both of you." 6 months after that terrible night, Jake and I moved into a small apartment across town. It had 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a view of a park where children played. It was perfect. I got promoted to assistant manager at the bakery. My boss, Mrs. Chen, had been incredibly supportive throughout everything, giving me time off for court dates and therapy appointments. "You're a different person now," she told me one day. "Stronger, happier." She was right. I was different. I laughed more. I spoke up when I disagreed with something. I made friends with other parents at Jake's school. One evening, as Jake and I sat at our small kitchen table doing homework together, he looked up at me with those wise eyes. "Are you happy now, Mom?" I reached over and touched his face, this brave boy who had saved us both. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm finally happy." And for the first time in years, I truly was.